All right, guys, today we're going to do a rounding review, and we're going to be talking about rounding place values, either bumping them up if they're 5 or more, or rounding them down if they are 4 or less. Okay, so we're going to be working, first things first, let's talk about place value. So this is a quick refresher on place value. When you have a number, each designated place is has a specific name. Okay, so like the 3 is in the hundredths place. The 8 is in the tens place. The second 8 there is in the ones place, and then we've got our decimal point. The 9 is the first place after the decimal point, and it is the tenths place. The second place after the decimal point with the 4, that's our hundredths place. This is our thousandths place, and then our 5 is in the 10,000ths place. So it's important to know those place values, because if it says round to the nearest whole number, we know we're going to round to the nearest ones place. If it says round to the nearest tenth, we know we're going to round to one place after the decimal point. So it's important that we know our place value. Okay, so now let's talk about our rounding rules. Our rounding rules, if it's 4 or less, we're going to let it rest. That means we're going to leave it alone. Okay, that number stays exactly the same. So if it's 4, if it's 3, if it's 2, if it's 1, if it's 0, if it's 4 or less, we're going to leave it alone, let it rest. We're not going to do anything to it. It's going to stay exactly the same. Now, if it's 5 and above, we're going to give it a shove. That means we're going to bump it up to the next number. So 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Any of those numbers that we see right next to it, we're going to bump that number up. So how we're going to show our work for rounding, the first thing that we're going to start by is by rewriting the decimal. Rewriting the decimal is really important because a lot of us just try to do this in our head, and that's where we kind of go awry sometimes. So we're going to rewrite the decimal, then we're going to underline the place value to which we're rounding. So if we're going to be rounding in the tenths place, I'm going to underline whatever number's in the tenths place, so I know that's where I'm looking at. Then right next to it, I'm going to look at that number that's next to it. If it's a 5 or above, if I'm going to give it a shove, I'm going to draw an arrow to remind myself that I'm going to bump that up. If it's 4 or less, I'm going to draw nothing. I'm going to leave it alone because that number is going to stay exactly the same, and I'm going to leave it alone. Okay, so let's test it out. Let's take a look at round to the nearest tenths place. And I have 2.368. If it wasn't already written for me, I would write that number down. Okay, and I'm going to underline the number that's in the tenths place. So I see that one place past the decimal is my tenths place. So this is the 3, so I'm going to underline that. And I know that this number is either going to be a 2.3 if it's going to stay the same, or a 2.4 if I'm going to bump it up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look next door. Next door I see a 6, so I'm going to draw my arrow because I'm going to bump that up. 6 is above 5, so I'm going to bump it up to 2.4. And that's my rounded to the tenths place. Okay. So now let's take a look at rounding to the nearest hundredths place. So the first things first, if it wasn't already written for me, I would rewrite it 55.642, and I'm going to underline my hundredths place because that's where I'm rounding. The hundredths place is 2 places after the decimal point, so I'm going to underline that 4. And I see I'm going to look next door and I have a 2 here. So I'm not going to draw anything at all. I know that that 2 leaves it the same, so I'm going to round it off at 55.64. That's my rounded to the nearest hundredths place. Okay. All right, let's look at some more together examples. Number 1 here says 0.43, and we're going to round to the nearest whole number. So my nearest whole number is right here, and I'm going to look next door. It is a 4, so I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to round it up. I'm just going to leave it as a whole number 0. All right, let's take a look at number 2. Number 2 says 6.02. We're going to round to the nearest tenths place. So I'm going to underline my tenths place, which is 1 place after the decimal, and I'm looking at the 2 next door. So the 2 is less than 4, so it's going to leave it alone. I'm not going to draw any arrows. It's just going to be a 6.0 rounded to the nearest tenth. Okay, let's take a look at number 3. 6.651. We're going to round to the nearest whole number. So I'm going to underline my 6, that's my whole number, and I'm going to look next door. Next door I see a 6, and I know that 6 is bump it up. So I'm going to draw my arrow, I'm going to bump it up. So the next whole number would be 7. Okay, number 4 says 0.02, and I'm going to be rounding to the hundredths place. So I'm going to go and I'm going to put a line under my 0 here because that's the hundredths place. And I'm going to look next door at this 2. 2 doesn't bump anything up, so I'm just going to round it off at 0.20. All right, let's take a look at number 5. Number 5 is 7.22, and I'm rounding to the nearest whole number. So my whole number is in this spot right here, the nearest whole, and I'm going to look next door at this 2. That's a 2, so it's not going to bump it up. It's going to leave it exactly the same, so my whole number is going to stay a 7. All right, number 6, let's take a look. We have 0.660, and I'm rounding to the nearest 10th place. So my 10th place is right here, and I'm going to look next door at the number next to it. Next door is a 6, and we know that 6's bump it up, so the next 10th place would be 0.7.
Good morning, Boyle County Middle School students, if you will.
Okay, number 7, we have 8.28, and we're going to be rounding to the nearest 10th place. So we have a 2 in the 10th place, and when I look next door, there's an 8, and we know that 8's bump it up. So rounded to the nearest 10th, I'm going to bump it up to 8.3. For rounding to the nearest whole number, I'm going to underline my 9 because that's my nearest whole number. Then I'm going to look next door. Next door there's an 8. So I'm going to bump it up, and I'm going to draw my arrow, bump it up to a 10. Okay, so now what you're going to do is you're going to work on those independent examples on your own, and be sure that you submit those through the link provided whenever you get finished.